The reservation always came in the same way. A phone call, never an app, never an email, placed exactly 19 days in advance, at 6 p.m., from a number the restaurant system had long since stopped flagging as unfamiliar. The voice on the other end was polite in the specific, careful way of a man who had rehearsed the sentence before dialing. Table for two. April the 14th. 7 o'clock. The corner booth if it's available. If it isn't, I'll wait for it. Elena Voss had picked up that call 4 times now, and 4 times she had written the same words on the same line of the same reservation book, and 4 times she had felt the same small, specific unease settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not because there was anything wrong with a man reserving a table for two. People did that every night of the week, for every reason a heart could invent. Anniversaries, apologies, first dates that both people were secretly terrified of, last dates neither of them would admit to planning. What unsettled Elena was that the man always came alone. He arrived at 7:04 every year, as if the 4 minutes of lateness were themselves part of the ritual, a small offering to whoever wasn't there to notice it. He wore a gray coat that had clearly once fit him better. He asked for the corner booth by name, the way regulars do, though he was not, by any ordinary definition, a regular. He came once. Exactly once. Then he vanished for 11 months and 26 days until the phone rang again. He always ordered for two. The first year, Elena had assumed, reasonably, that someone was running late. She had watched the door the way she watched every door on a slow Tuesday, half curious, half bored, waiting for the second guest who would complete the picture and let her stop wondering about it. No one came. He sat across from an empty chair and a full-place setting, unfolded a napkin that no one would use, and ordered a bottle of a Sancerre that the restaurant kept in limited supply specifically, she would later learn, because he asked for it every single year. He talked while he ate. Not loudly. Not in a way that drew attention from the other tables, though Elena, positioned at the host's stand with a sightline into the corner booth that she told herself was coincidental, noticed it immediately. His lips moved between bites. His head tilted once, as though someone across from him had just said something dry enough to deserve exactly that expression. He laughed, quietly, at nothing. He reached once, briefly, toward the empty side of the table, and then seemed to catch himself, and pulled his hand back into his lap like a man remembering, mid-motion, an old injury. He stayed until 9:40. He left a tip that made the servers argue, gently, over who would get his section the following year. He walked out into whatever weather April had decided on, and Elena did not see him again for 359 days. The second year, she told herself she had imagined the strangeness of it. The third year, she stopped telling herself that. By the fourth year, Elena had worked at Cardinal and Ash for long enough to have earned the title of general manager, a job that came with a specific authority to know things about the restaurant that the servers didn't, including the name attached to a reservation that had been placed under the same phone number for 4 consecutive Aprils. Julian Marsh. That was the name in the system. Nothing else. No notes, no allergies, no history beyond 4 identical lines in 4 identical years, each one requesting the same table, the same wine, the same 2-place settings for one man who would eat alone in front of an audience of no one and leave like he was fleeing something he had specifically driven 40 minutes to arrive at. She had never spoken to him beyond the necessary sentences. Good evening. Right this way. Thank you, we hope to see you again. He had never once looked at her the way people look at a person they might remember. He looked at the booth. He looked at the empty chair. He looked, on 2 occasions that she had noticed and filed away without knowing why she was filing it, at the door, as though some part of him still expected it to open for someone specific. It never did. The staff had their own private mythology about him, the way restaurant staff always build mythology around any regular strange, enough to earn it. Priya, who had waited his table for 3 consecutive years before a schedule change handed him permanently to someone else, still brought him up at least once a month, usually over the family meal before dinner service, usually starting with the same 4 words. You ever figure out the chair guy? He's not the chair guy, Priya, Elena said, the third or fourth time it came up, with more patience than the question probably deserved. He's a paying customer with a private life he's entitled to keep private. I'm not saying he's not entitled to it, Priya said, spearing a piece of family meal chicken with a specific theatrical outrage of someone who has clearly been waiting all week for permission to say this out loud. I'm saying I served that man for 3 years, and I watched him laugh at things nobody said, and I have never once in my life wanted to know a stranger's business more badly, and I think that's a completely normal human reaction, and I refuse to be shamed for it. Nobody's shaming you, said Dana, the other server on shift, not looking up from her own plate. We're all thinking it. She's just the only one professional enough not to say it out loud at family meal. I think it's someone he lost, Priya said, quieter now, the joke draining out of her voice the way it always eventually did when the staff talked about him for long enough. Has to be. Nobody performs that specifically, that carefully once a year for anything less than the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Elena had never confirmed or denied it in 4 years of these conversations, though privately she had believed exactly the same thing since the 2nd April, and had never once said so, because some suspicions, she believed, belonged to the person who carried them and not to a lunch table full of curious coworkers. It was Priya, in fact, who noticed first, on the 5th April, that something about the reservation felt different before Elena had said a word. Table for 2, right? Corner booth, Priya asked, glancing at the book that morning, already reaching for the setup she had memorized without needing to check. Table for 2, Elena confirmed, and did not yet know how wrong she was about to be. This was the story of the 5th April. And it was the year everything about the ritual, quiet, private, untouchable for 4 years, finally cracked open in front of her, because this was the year Julian Marsh walked through the door at 7:00 for exactly on schedule, sat down in the corner booth exactly on schedule, and did something he had never done before. He ordered for one. Elena noticed it from across the room before the server had even reached the kitchen with the ticket. The second place setting sat untouched at the edge of the table, the way it always had, but this time nothing was ordered for it. No second glass of Sancerre. No second entree arriving at the careful, matched pace the kitchen had learned to keep without ever being told why it mattered. Just one plate, one glass, one man, sitting across from an empty chair that was, for the first time in 5 years, actually empty in the way the rest of the world understood the word. Something about it looked less like grief and more like surrender. Elena watched him from the host stand longer than she should have. She told herself it was curiosity, the professional kind, the kind that came from 5 years of quietly wondering about a man who had never given her a single reason to wonder, and every reason not to. She told herself it was nothing more than that. She was already crossing the room before she had decided to. Is everything all right with your table tonight, Mr. Marsh? It was the first full sentence she had ever spoken to him that wasn't scripted by the job. She watched it land somewhere behind his eyes, a small flicker of surprise that someone had used his name, that someone had noticed him at all beyond the transaction of seating and serving and clearing. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "You know my name," he said. Not a question. An observation, offered carefully, the way a man tests weight on ice he isn't sure will hold him. "I know a lot of names," Elena said. "Yours has come up 19 times in 5 years. Same date. Same request. It gets noticed eventually." Something crossed his face that she couldn't immediately name. Not embarrassment. Something closer to relief, and something closer to fear, arriving at exactly the same moment, the way two people sometimes reach the same door from opposite sides. "I imagine it does," he said quietly. He looked at the empty place setting across from him, the napkin still folded, the silverware still untouched, the wine glass still empty in a way that felt, for the first time in 5 years, deliberate rather than devotional. "This is the last one," he said. "This is the last time I'm doing this." Elena felt something in her chest tighten in a way she had absolutely no professional reason to feel. "May I ask why?" she said. Julian Marsh looked up at her, and for the first time in 5 Aprils, he actually seemed to see her. Not as the woman who had seated him 19 times, not as a fixture of the restaurant he returned to like a pilgrim visiting the same shrine, but as a person standing in front of him asking a question he had spent 5 years avoiding answering, even to himself. "Because tonight," he said, "I finally have to tell someone the truth about who used to sit in that chair. And I think, after 5 years of watching me do this, you've earned the right to be the one I tell it to." He gestured, without quite meaning to, toward the seat across from him. Elena Voss sat down in the chair that had been empty for 5 years, and she did not yet understand that she was about to become the second person in this story to fall in love with someone who wasn't sitting across from her anymore. Elena Voss was 31 years old, and she had built her entire adult life around the specific, load-bearing belief that other people's feelings were easier to manage than her own. It was, she privately understood, the reason she had become good at her job. A restaurant floor at 8 o'clock on a Friday is a kind of controlled emotional weather system, a table celebrating a promotion 2 feet from a table quietly ending a marriage, both of them needing the same warm bread and the same unhurried water refill and the same practiced, invisible attention that lets people feel taken care of without ever feeling watched. Elena had a gift for it. She could read a room the way other people read a paragraph, front to back, cover to cover, in under 4 seconds. She knew which tables wanted to be left alone, and which ones were quietly begging for a reason to talk to somebody. She had built a career on that instinct, and she had built a life, less deliberately, on the exact same skill turned inward, the specific talent of knowing, with total clarity, what everyone around her needed, while remaining almost entirely unable to answer the question of what she needed herself. She had been engaged once, for years earlier, to a man named Colin who had loved her the way people love a convenience, steadily, comfortably, without ever once being curious about the parts of her that weren't immediately visible. He had proposed in a restaurant much like this one on a Tuesday, for no reason she had ever been able to identify beyond his own private calendar of when things were supposed to happen next. She had said yes. She had meant it at the time in the specific limited way a person means something when they have not yet been given a reason to imagine an alternative. 8 months later, she had found the reason. It hadn't been dramatic. There had been no scene, no confrontation, no discovered message glowing accusingly on a phone left unlocked on a countertop. It had simply been a slow, creeping recognition that Colin had never once asked her a question about herself that he didn't already assume he knew the answer to, and that she had spent 2 years of her life being loved as an idea rather than as a person, and that the specific loneliness of being deeply known by no one while surrounded, every day, by a room full of people who thought they knew her, that particular loneliness had a taste, and once she had noticed it, she could not stop tasting it in everything. She had ended it herself, quietly, kindly, as much as these things can be kind. And she had returned to the restaurant floor the following week with the specific, hard-won clarity of a woman who had decided that being needed by strangers was a safer and more honest transaction than being loved by someone who had never really looked at her. For 4 years, that had been enough. It had never once occurred to her, in any of those years, that the thing that would finally crack that careful architecture open would be a man who came into her restaurant exactly once a year, ate dinner across from an empty chair, and left before she ever learned his first name. Julian Marsh was 38, and he had spent the last 6 years of his life organizing the world into 2 categories: the parts of it that reminded him of Ava, and the parts of it he had trained himself not to look at too closely because they didn't. He worked as an architect, which he had once found funny. In the dry, aching way certain jokes become funny only after they stop being sayable out loud. A man who had spent his career designing spaces meant to hold people safely, who had failed on one specific Tuesday 6 years ago, to build anything at all that could hold the one person he had actually needed to protect. Ava Sinclair had been 29 when she died. She had been, by every account anyone who knew her would offer without hesitation, the kind of person who made rooms rearrange themselves around her without ever seeming to try, not because she demanded attention, but because she gave it so completely to whoever she was speaking to that they found themselves, afterward, wanting to be better than they had been 5 minutes earlier. She had been a pediatric nurse. She had cried at commercials and laughed at funerals, not out of disrespect but out of some deep, stubborn insistence that grief and joy were never as separate as people pretended. She had loved Julian in a way that had frightened him slightly in the beginning, because he had never been loved with that much unguarded certainty before, and some small, suspicious part of him had spent the first year of their relationship waiting for the catch. There had never been a catch. There had only, eventually, been a Tuesday. They had been engaged for 6 weeks. They had chosen Cardinal and Ash for their engagement dinner specifically, because it was the restaurant where they'd had their first real date 3 years earlier. The date where Ava had ordered dessert first, on principle, and told Julian that any relationship built around delaying joy for the sake of proper sequence was a relationship not worth having, and Julian, 29 minutes into knowing her, had already understood that he was going to marry this woman if she would have him. They had booked the corner booth for April 14th at 7 o'clock. Ava had been running 11 minutes late, held up by a shift that had gone long the way pediatric shifts sometimes do, a small patient who needed one more reassurance before her shift could officially end. She had been 3 minutes from the restaurant when the driver of a delivery van, checking a phone instead of an intersection, had run a red light at a speed that made the outcome instant in a way that Julian had spent 6 years being told by well-meaning people was supposed to be a mercy. He had been sitting in the corner booth when it happened. He had ordered the wine. He had been checking his own phone, smiling at a text from her, running late. "Don't you dare start without me. Save room for dessert first," when a different call came through instead, and the entire architecture of his future collapsed into a single unbearable sentence delivered by a stranger at a hospital he would spend the rest of his life associating with the specific antiseptic smell of every worst thing that had ever happened to him. He had not been able to finish the story, that first year, of how he had come to be sitting in that same booth exactly 1 year later. It had not, in the beginning, been a plan. It had been an accident of grief, the way the first year after a death is full of accidental rituals that only reveal themselves as rituals in retrospect. He had found himself, on the 1-year anniversary of the accident, unable to be anywhere else. He had called the restaurant without entirely deciding to. He had asked for the same booth, ordered the same wine, and sat there for 2 hours and 36 minutes talking to Ava the way he had talked to her every day for 3 years, filling the silence on the other side of the table with the version of her voice he kept carefully preserved in his memory, because it was the only version of conversation with her he had left, and he was not, in that first raw year, prepared to let it go quiet. The second year, he had told himself he was doing it because stopping felt like a second death. The third year, he had told himself he was doing it because Ava deserved a place in the world that remembered her specifically, deliberately, once a year, in the restaurant where she had once ordered dessert first out of principle. The fourth year, he had stopped telling himself reasons at all, and simply gone, the way a person keeps breathing without narrating each breath. The fifth year, this year, something had shifted, and he had not entirely understood what it was until he was already sitting in the booth with a single place setting in front of him instead of 2, staring across the table at a woman he had barely looked at in 5 years of 19 brief, scripted sentences, realizing with a kind of quiet horror that he could no longer remember, with total certainty, the exact sound of Ava's laugh. That was the thing no one warns you about grief, 6 years in. It does not announce its softening. It simply, one day, lets a detail slip through its fingers, and you do not notice the detail is gone until you go looking for it and find an outline where the memory used to be. He had panicked quietly for 3 weeks before this dinner. He had listened to old voicemails until his phone battery died twice in one evening. He had found himself, at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday that meant nothing calendar-wise but everything emotionally, standing in his kitchen trying to remember whether Ava's laugh had started high and dropped low, or the other way around, and being unable, for the first time in 6 years, to answer his own question with certainty. It was this, not closure, not readiness, not any of the tidy words grief books like to use, that had brought him to Cardinal and Ash this April with the decision already half made in his chest. If he could no longer trust his memory to hold her, then continuing the ritual as he had always performed it felt, suddenly, like a kind of lie. A performance of grief rather than a genuine act of it. He owed Ava more honesty than that. He owed himself more honesty than that. He had planned, walking in, to eat one final dinner across from her empty chair, quietly say goodbye to a ritual rather than to her, and leave Cardinal and Ash for the last time. He had not planned on the general manager sitting down across from him and asking, with a directness no one had used with him in 6 years, why the second-place setting had gone unordered for the first time in 5 Aprils. He had not planned on wanting, immediately and inconveniently, to tell her everything. "I don't usually do this," Elena said, once she was seated, once the silence had stretched long enough that someone needed to be the one to end it. "Sit down at a guest's table. It's not really standard practice." "No," Julian agreed. "I imagine watching a man talk to an empty chair for 5 years isn't standard practice either, and you've managed that with remarkable professionalism." It surprised a laugh out of her, short, unguarded, the kind of laugh that arrives before a person has decided whether the moment deserves it. "You noticed that I notice." "I notice more than people assume," Julian said. "It's an occupational hazard. You spend enough years designing spaces for a living, you start reading rooms as though they're confessing something. This room." He gestured faintly at the booth, the untouched place setting, the whole quiet architecture of 5 years of grief performed in public. "This room has been confessing something for a long time. I think I finally have to say it out loud instead of making the room say it for me." Elena said nothing. She had learned, across a decade in hospitality, the specific power of a well-timed silence, the way it could hold a door open for someone without pushing them through it. She held the door open now and waited. "Her name was Ava," Julian said. "She would have been sitting exactly where you're sitting 6 years ago tonight, if a man checking his phone at an intersection 3 minutes from here hadn't run a red light going 40 miles an hour. Elena felt the sentence land somewhere just beneath her ribs, the particular blunt weight of a truth she had spent 5 years suspecting and had never once let herself fully imagine. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it in the specific, unguarded way she rarely let herself mean things at work anymore. "Everyone says that," Julian said, not unkindly. "It's the correct thing to say. I've said it myself, at other people's funerals 100 times, and never once understood, until it was my turn to hear it, how completely inadequate 3 words can be for the size of the thing they're trying to hold." He looked at the empty chair across from him, really looked at it, Elena noticed, in a way that felt different from the 4 Aprils she'd watched from across the room. Less like a man speaking to a ghost. More like a man saying goodbye to a habit. "I've come here every year since," he said. "Same date, same booth, same order for both of us every year until tonight. I don't entirely know how to explain why, except that for a long time, it was the only place in my life where I still felt like her fiancé instead of just a man who used to have one." "And tonight?" Elena asked quietly. Julian was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass slowly by its stem, watching the light catch and let go of it. "Tonight, I realized I'm starting to forget the sound of her laugh," he said. "And I think some part of me has known for a while that if I keep performing this exact ritual, exactly this way, forever, I'm not honoring her memory anymore. I'm hiding from the fact that it's fading, the way memories are supposed to fade, and using this booth as a place to pretend they aren't." He looked up at Elena then, and something in his expression had shifted. Not lighter, exactly, but less braced, the way a person looks after finally setting down something heavy they'd forgotten they were still carrying. "I came here tonight to say goodbye to this," he said. "Not to her. I don't think you ever really get to say goodbye to someone like that. Just to this version of remembering her. The version that happens once a year, in a booth, talking to an empty chair while a very patient restaurant staff pretends not to notice." "We noticed," Elena said softly. We just didn't think it was ours to interrupt. I know, Julian said. I think that's part of why I kept coming back. Nobody here ever made me explain it. You just let me have it. Elena felt something complicated move through her chest, a specific, unfamiliar ache that she recognized, distantly, as the shape grief takes when it belongs to someone else and you're standing close enough to feel its edges anyway. Can I ask you something, she said, and you can tell me it's none of my business. You've already sat down at my table for a dead woman's dinner, Julian said, with the faintest ghost of dry humor. I think we're past the point of business. Why table for two, this whole time? Elena asked. Instead of, I don't know, coming alone, ordering one meal, sitting with her memory without performing the whole shape of what a dinner for two would have looked like. Julian considered the question with the seriousness of a man who had clearly asked himself the same thing many times, in many quieter rooms than this one. Because grief isn't really about missing the last time you saw someone, he said finally. It's about missing all the times you were supposed to get and didn't. Every anniversary we never had. Every ordinary Tuesday dinner that would have meant nothing, that I would have taken completely for granted, and would give almost anything now to have back. The empty chair was never really about honoring the past. It was about all the future I lost the right to build with her. Table for two was the only way I knew how to keep a place for that future to still, in some impossible way, exist. He paused, and something in his voice changed. Quieter, more uncertain. A man arriving at a thought in real time rather than reciting one he'd already made peace with. I think that's why I couldn't order for two tonight, he said. Because some part of me has finally admitted that the future isn't there anymore to keep a place for. And I don't know yet what it means to sit at a table for one, and call that moving forward instead of giving up. Elena sat with that for a long moment, the noise of the restaurant continuing on around them, oblivious, the way ordinary life always continues on around the exact moment someone else's world quietly rearranges itself. For what it's worth, she said carefully, I don't think it has to mean either of those things tonight. I think it can just mean you're here. Same booth, same wine, different chapter. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. That's a very generous way of putting it, he said. I've had 5 years of practice being generous about this particular table, Elena said, and something in the way she said it, dry, warm, entirely unprofessional in the best possible sense, pulled a real smile out of him. The first one she had ever actually seen on his face in 5 Aprils of watching him from across the room. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, how long she had been sitting in the chair that had been reserved, every year for 5 years, for someone who was never coming back. Neither of them noticed, either, how easily she had stopped feeling like she was intruding on a stranger's grief and started feeling, instead, like she had been quietly, carefully invited into it. There was a version of that night, 6 years earlier, that Julian had never told anyone in full. Not his sister, not his mother, not even, in the beginning, himself, in the sense that a person can spend years circling a memory without ever letting it land completely. He had arrived at Cardinal and Ash at 6:52 that first April 14th, 8 minutes early, the way a man arrives when he has spent 3 weeks rehearsing a question he intends to ask before dessert. The ring had been in his coat pocket for 11 days, small and specific and impossibly heavy for something that weighed almost nothing. He had chosen the corner booth himself, back when choosing it had been an ordinary act of romantic planning rather than a ritual of grief. He had ordered the Sancerre because Ava had mentioned it once, months earlier at a friend's dinner party, in the offhand way people mention things they like without expecting anyone to remember, and Julian had remembered, because remembering the small things Ava said had become, somewhere in 3 years of loving her, the closest thing he had to a religious practice. She had texted him at 6:58. Running 10 minutes behind, don't you dare start without me. Save room for dessert first. He had smiled at his phone the way a man smiles when he is about to marry someone who has taught him that joy does not need to be earned in the correct order. He had been composing his reply, something teasing, something about how she was always exactly 10 minutes behind on nights that mattered most, a fact he found unbearably endearing rather than frustrating, when his phone had rung instead of buzzed, an unfamiliar number, the kind he would ordinarily have let go to voicemail on a night this important. He had answered it anyway. He had never afterward been able to explain why, except that some small, animal part of him had understood, before the first word was spoken, that this was not a call he was permitted to ignore. The next 40 minutes existed, in Julian's memory, as a series of disconnected fragments rather than a continuous scene, the specific, sterile color of a hospital corridor at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday. A nurse whose name he had never learned, saying words he had understood individually and had been entirely unable to assemble into a sentence that made sense. The ring, still in his coat pocket, suddenly the heaviest object he had ever carried, because there was no longer, in the space of one ordinary intersection 3 minutes from a restaurant, anyone left to give it to. He had gone back to the restaurant afterward, not that night. He had no memory of that night beyond the hospital corridor, but weeks later, once the funeral had been survived and the condolence casseroles had stopped arriving and the specific unbearable quiet of a life built for two suddenly being lived by one had settled in for what he understood, even then, was going to be a very long time. He had gone back because Ava's coat was still hanging on the back of a chair that the restaurant, out of a kindness he had never properly thanked them for, had quietly kept for him rather than folding into lost and found. He had gone back to collect it, and had ended up sitting in the corner booth for 2 hours, holding a coat that still smelled like her, unable to make himself leave, and somewhere in those 2 hours, without deciding to, he had made the promise that would shape the next 6 years of his life. He would come back. Every year. Same booth. Same order for both of them, because leaving an empty place at that table felt, in the raw arithmetic of new grief, like the only structurally sound thing left standing in a life that had otherwise entirely collapsed. He had never told Elena the part about the ring. Not that first night, not for months afterward. He kept it in a drawer in his apartment that he did not open, the way some doors in a house are simply, permanently closed, not out of active pain anymore, but out of the specific respect a person learns to have for the rooms that used to hold something they can no longer bear to look at directly. He would tell her eventually. Not yet. Some truths, he had learned, need their own separate reservation, made only when a person is finally ready to sit across from them without flinching. He did not leave at 9:40 that night. He stayed until closing, long after the last other table had paid its check and drifted out into the dark, long after the busboys had started resetting the far side of the room in the specific, unhurried choreography of people who knew their manager wouldn't mind if they took their time tonight. Elena sat across from him for most of it, breaking away twice to handle something only she could handle, returning both times without needing to explain why. They talked about small things, in the careful way people do when they've just told each other something enormous and need somewhere gentler to rest afterward. He asked about the restaurant, how long she'd worked there, what she'd wanted to do before hospitality had quietly become the thing she was good at instead of the thing she'd planned. She told him about the architecture degree she'd started and never finished, the specific, private embarrassment of having once wanted to design buildings and ending up, instead, managing the inside of one. You should have led with that, Julian said, something lighting behind his eyes for the first time all night. I could have spent 5 years talking to you about load-bearing walls instead of an empty chair. I don't think either of us was ready for that conversation 5 years ago, Elena said. No, he agreed. I don't think I was ready for very much of anything 5 years ago. He left, finally, a little after 11, with the specific reluctance of a man who has just discovered a room he didn't know he needed and isn't sure when he'll be allowed back into it. At the door, he paused. I don't actually know your name, he said. 5 years, and I never once asked. Elena, she said. Elena Voss. Elena, Julian repeated, like he was setting it down carefully somewhere he intended to find it again. Thank you. For sitting down. I don't think I would have said any of that to an empty chair. You don't have to wait a year to come back, you know, Elena said, and immediately felt her own pulse pick up at the audacity of it, the specific unprofessional risk of a sentence she couldn't take back once it was out of her mouth. Cardinal and Ash does serve dinner on days that aren't April 14th. Something crossed his face, surprise first, and then something warmer underneath it, something that looked almost like permission. I might take you up on that, he said. He did not come back the next week, or the week after. Elena told herself this was fine, expected, the natural order of things. A man who had just admitted, out loud, for the first time in 6 years, that his grief was changing shape did not owe anyone a follow-up dinner on any particular schedule. She told herself this several times, with decreasing conviction. Across 17 days that she counted with an attentiveness she refused to examine too closely. He came back on the 18th day. A Wednesday. Not a special date on any calendar, but the ordinary kind. The kind Ava had apparently loved best, the kind Julian had spent 6 years unable to enjoy without guilt attached to the enjoying. He asked for a table for one. Elena seated him herself, at a smaller table near the window this time, not the corner booth, a detail she noticed him notice, a small flicker of something crossing his face that might have been relief. I wasn't sure the booth was mine to ask for outside of April, he said, by way of explanation she hadn't requested. It's a restaurant, Mr. Marsh, Elena said. Every table is available to anyone brave enough to ask a hostess for it. Julian, he said. I think we're past Mr. Marsh. Julian, she agreed, and something in the shape of his name in her mouth felt, absurdly, like the beginning of something she hadn't given herself permission to want yet. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Never announced, never on a schedule, always ordering a table for one and staying long enough that Elena found reasons, increasingly transparent ones, she was aware, and increasingly unbothered by how transparent they were, to linger near his table between the other duties of running a restaurant on a Wednesday night. They talked about buildings, the way he'd promised. He told her about the specific joy of solving a structural problem that looked impossible on paper, the way a well-designed space could make people feel safe without ever consciously noticing why. She told him about the year she'd spent, before hospitality swallowed her calendar whole, actually sketching load-bearing walls in a studio apartment too small to hold the ambition she'd had for herself at 23. You should go back to it, Julian said one Wednesday in May, with the specific conviction of a man who designed things for a living and recognized talent when he heard someone describe it, even secondhand, even 6 years too late to have seen the sketches themselves. Maybe, Elena said, in the noncommittal tone of someone who had said maybe to that particular ambition for 8 straight years and had started to suspect the word had become a permanent address rather than a temporary one. He told her, slowly, in pieces offered across several Wednesdays rather than all at once, more about Ava. Not the accident. They had covered that, once, completely, and neither of them felt the need to revisit the wound directly again. Instead, he told her the smaller things, the things that made a person rather than a tragedy, the way Ava had insisted on ordering dessert first on principle. The stray cat she'd fed for 2 years outside her apartment, before finally admitting it lived with her now. The way she cried at insurance commercials and then pretended, unconvincingly, that she hadn't. The fact that she had once talked her way into a hospital gift shop after hours to buy a specific stuffed elephant for a scared 8-year-old patient, because the vending machine version of comfort hadn't seemed like enough. Elena listened to all of it with the specific attentiveness of a woman who understood, somewhere underneath the listening, that she was falling for a man in the process of teaching her, piece by piece, exactly how thoroughly he had once loved somebody else. She did not know, yet, whether that made her a person helping him heal, or a person about to be quietly, unintentionally hurt by the shape of a grief that had nowhere else left to go. It took until June for either of them to say anything that could not be walked back the next morning. It happened unglamorously, over a bottle of wine that was not the Sancerre. Julian had ordered something different, a small, deliberate departure that Elena noticed and did not comment on a Wednesday that had otherwise been entirely unremarkable. The restaurant had emptied early. Elena had sat down across from him, without the pretense of checking on his table, an honesty about the whole arrangement that neither of them had bothered disguising in weeks. "Can I tell you something that's going to sound insane?" Julian said, turning his glass slowly. "And I need you to let me finish the whole sentence before you respond, because if you interrupt me, I will absolutely lose my nerve." "I have a policy of letting people finish sentences," Elena said. "Occupational hazard of running a restaurant. You learn fast that half of hospitality is just letting people get to the end of what they're trying to say. I think I started coming back here for reasons that stopped being entirely about Ava somewhere around the third Wednesday," Julian said, "and I've spent every night since trying to decide whether that's a betrayal of her memory or the first genuinely honest thing I've felt in 6 years, and I don't actually know the answer. But I know that I look forward to Wednesdays in a way I haven't looked forward to anything since before the accident, and I think that's about you, and I think I need to say that out loud instead of just showing up here every week and hoping you notice without making me be brave enough to say it." He stopped. He had, evidently, run out of the sentence he'd rehearsed. Elena sat very still, aware of her own heartbeat in a way she rarely let herself be aware of anything at work. "I noticed," she said quietly. "That's not exactly a response to what I just said," Julian said, with the ghost of a nervous laugh. "I've been noticing you for 5 years, Julian," Elena said. "Long before you knew my name. I used to watch you talk to an empty chair and feel something I had absolutely no professional right to feel, and I told myself for 5 years it was just curiosity, and it was never just curiosity. And I think I've known that since the night you finally sat down and told me who used to sit across from you." Something in Julian's face broke open, not sadly, not the way grief breaks a face open, but the way relief does, the specific unguarded relief of a person who has said an enormous true thing out loud and discovered, against every fear he'd been carrying into the sentence, that it had been received rather than rejected. "I don't know how to do this without it feeling like I'm being unfaithful to someone who's been gone for 6 years, he admitted. "I know intellectually that's not how grief is supposed to work. I know she would never have wanted me to spend the rest of my life eating dinner alone across from a chair. But knowing something and feeling it are apparently 2 very different rooms in the same house, and I haven't fully moved into the second one yet." "I'm not asking you to be finished grieving her," Elena said. "I don't think that's a real thing people finish. I think I'm just asking whether there's room in the house for both." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked, for the first time since Elena had known him, less like a man carrying something and more like a man setting a small piece of it down, carefully, in a place he trusted it wouldn't shatter. "I think there might be," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not, by any measure either of them would have described it, a beginning in the tidy, cinematic sense. It was smaller than that, and truer than that. 2 careful people, each of them fluent in the specific grammar of loss, agreeing, quietly, over a bottle of wine that was not the Sancerre, to find out together whether there was room. Neither of them yet knew about the letter. The letter arrived unannounced, on a Thursday in late June, carried into Julian's life by his sister Mara with the specific, careful urgency of someone delivering something she had been sitting on for longer than she was proud of. "Mom found it going through her cedar chest," Mara said, standing in Julian's kitchen with an envelope held slightly away from her body, as though it might still be capable of causing damage 6 years after it had been written. "Ava gave it to her the month before the accident. Said if anything ever happened to either of you, Mom should make sure you got it, but not right away," she said. Mara hesitated, choosing the next words with visible care. "She said you'd know when you were ready, and Mom should trust your timing over her own." Julian stood very still in his own kitchen, looking at an envelope with his name written on it in handwriting he would have recognized in complete darkness, from any distance, for the rest of his life. "Why now?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Mom said she's been carrying it for 6 years, wondering if she was protecting you or failing you by waiting, Mara said. She said last week she watched you laugh at something on the phone, actually laugh, for the first time since the funeral, and she decided that whatever this was, you were finally someone who could survive reading it. Julian did not open the letter that night. He sat with it, unopened, on the kitchen counter for 4 days, the way a person sits with a door they are both desperate and terrified to walk through, and on the 5th day, alone, with the specific deliberateness of a man performing a ritual he understood might change the shape of everything that came after it, he opened it. Ava's handwriting filled 2 pages, front and back, dated 8 months before the accident. Long before either of them had any reason to believe they were writing anything but an ordinary, sentimental note meant to be read decades later, in old age, as a curiosity from a marriage grown comfortable with time. She had written about small things first. A joke about his habit of over-explaining light fixtures at dinner parties. A memory of their second date, the one he always forgot, came before the diner, when he had gotten genuinely lost trying to find a parking garage he had visited 100 times before and refused, out of pure stubbornness, to admit it or ask for directions. She had written that she loved him specifically because he was a man who would rather be quietly, hopelessly lost than admit he needed help, and that she had spent the entire drive home from that date planning, with total unearned confidence, the next 40 years of teaching him it was safe to ask for things. And then, near the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that had visibly slowed, the pen pressed a little harder into the paper, as though she had needed a moment before continuing. If you're reading this, something has happened to one of us, and I genuinely don't know which version of this letter I'm writing. I don't know if I'm about to comfort you, or if you're about to comfort me for something that happened to you. I hope it's neither. I hope this stays in Diane's cedar chest until we're both old and gray-haired and reading it together on some anniversary, laughing at how morbid I was in my 20s. But if it isn't, if you're reading this alone, I need you to promise me something, and I need you to actually keep the promise instead of just agreeing with it the way you agree with things you have no intention of doing, which, yes, I have noticed, and yes, I love you anyway. Don't build a museum out of me. I know you. I know that if something happened to me, your instinct would be to freeze everything exactly as it was, to hold on so tightly that nothing new could ever get close enough to threaten the shape of what we had. And I understand why that would feel like love. It isn't. It's just fear, wearing love's coat. If I'm gone, grieve me completely. Take as long as you need, I mean that. Take years if years is what it costs. But somewhere on the other side of that grief, I need you to leave room for something I will never get to see, because the alternative is that you spend the rest of your life keeping a chair empty for me, instead of living a life I would be furious to learn you gave up on my account. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Julian Marsh. Don't let being loved by me become the reason you never let yourself be loved again. Save room for dessert first. Always. Even when I'm not the one across the table anymore. All my love, always. Ava. Julian did not remember, afterward, how long he sat at his kitchen table before he could stand up again. He knew only that when he finally called Elena, his voice was unsteady in a way he had not let it be unsteady in front of another person in 6 years, and that she had come to him within the hour, without asking a single question he wasn't ready to answer yet. He showed her the letter 3 days later. He needed those 3 days, he told her honestly, to read it enough times that showing it to someone else wouldn't feel like handing over something too raw to survive being witnessed. Elena read it twice, in silence, at his kitchen table, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet in a way she made no attempt to hide. She sounds like she was extraordinary, she said quietly. She was, Julian said. I don't want you to think, Elena said carefully, that I need you to have written this letter to justify anything you feel for me. I fell for you before I ever knew this existed. I don't need Ava's permission for that to be real. I know, Julian said. But I think I needed it anyway. Not to justify it to you. To myself. He looked down at the letter, at handwriting he would know in total darkness for the rest of his life. I've spent 6 years terrified that moving forward meant proving I never really loved her as much as I thought I did. This is the first time anyone's told me the opposite might be true. That loving her all the way through meant eventually being brave enough to keep living. Elena reached across the table and took his hand, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was, for once, nothing that needed saying. It should have been the turning point where everything settled into something easy. It was not. Because 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday that meant nothing on any calendar Elena kept, Julian stopped answering his phone. It started small enough that Elena almost missed it. A Wednesday dinner canceled with a text that read, simply, something came up, sorry. A sentence so ordinary that she filed it away without much thought, the way anyone would. Life happened. Things came up. She had learned, across a decade of watching couples cancel and reschedule and cancel again in her restaurant, that a single missed dinner meant almost nothing. The second missed Wednesday came with no text at all. By the third, Elena had called twice and texted 4 times, each message a little more careful, a little more deliberately casual, the specific performance of a woman trying not to sound as worried as she had actually become. Hey, just checking in. Hope everything's okay. No pressure to respond, just wanted you to know I'm here if you need anything. Nothing came back. Not that day. Not the next. She told herself, the way people always tell themselves in the specific quiet after someone they love goes silent, that there were 100 reasonable explanations that had nothing to do with her. A death in the family. The phrase alone made her stomach drop, considering everything she now knew about the particular fragility of Julian's relationship with sudden loss. A work crisis. A phone lost, or broken, or simply left in a coat pocket for 3 days by a man who had never fully adjusted to the specific tyranny of being constantly reachable. She did not believe any of the 100 reasonable explanations, not really. What she believed, in the small, unguarded hours when she couldn't stop herself from believing it, was that she had somehow become too much, that 6 years of careful, contained grief had finally been asked to make room for something it wasn't ready to hold, and that Julian had done the only thing that made sense to a man terrified of losing something twice. He had left before the something could be lost at all. She did not go to his apartment. She had learned, across her own quiet catastrophe with Colin 4 years earlier, the specific dignity of not chasing a silence that hadn't invited her in. She waited instead, the way she had learned to wait for the second half of every difficult conversation her job had ever handed her, understanding that some silences need to be respected even when respecting them feels like its own kind of grief. She told Priya about it on the 9th day, unable to hold it alone any longer, the two of them folding napkins in the quiet hour before dinner service while Elena tried to explain, in the careful, deflecting language of someone not ready to admit how frightened she actually was, that Julian had gone quiet and she didn't know why. You want my honest opinion? Priya asked, not waiting for permission to give it. I watched that man perform the same grief ritual for 3 straight years before you ever sat down at his table. Whatever's happening right now, it's not about you being too much. Men like that don't disappear because someone loved them wrong. They disappear because loving someone right finally forced them to feel something they spent years successfully avoiding. That's either very wise or something you read on a coaster, Elena said. Can be both, Priya said, unbothered. Give him room. You of all people know the difference between someone leaving and someone catching their breath. Elena had held on to that distinction for 2 more days, turning it over the way she turned over everything, testing its weight against the specific silence on the other end of her phone, hoping, with a hope she didn't fully trust, that Priya was right. On the 11th day, her phone rang at 10:40 at night. I need to tell you where I've been, Julian said, before she'd even fully said hello, his voice carrying a specific rawness that told her, before he'd said another word, that whatever had happened had cost him something. You don't owe me an explanation for taking space, Elena said carefully, even as her heart pounded with 11 days of unspoken fear. But I'd like to hear it if you want to tell me. I went to see her parents, Julian said. Ava's. I hadn't been to see them since the 2nd anniversary of the accident. It got complicated after the first year. Being around each other made all of us relive it in a way none of us could survive doing regularly, so we drifted, the way grieving people sometimes drift from each other even when they love each other, because proximity to shared pain isn't always the comfort people assume it is. What made you go now? Elena asked. The letter, Julian said. I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the fact that Ava's mother had been carrying it for 6 years, deciding when I was ready, and I realized I'd never once asked her what that had cost her, to hold something that big for that long without being able to put it down. I went to thank her, and I ended up telling her about you. Elena's breath caught. How did that go? There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Elena felt her pulse climb into her throat, waiting for the rest of it. She cried, Julian said finally, for a long time, and then she told me something I wasn't prepared for, which is that she'd been quietly terrified, for 6 years, that I was going to spend the rest of my life keeping that booth reserved for a woman I'd never let myself stop reserving it for. She said watching me disappear into my grief had felt, to her, like losing a second child, not to death, this time, but to a kind of living absence that never actually ended. She said hearing that I'd met someone was the first time in 6 years she'd felt like she got to keep any part of me at all. That sounds like it should have been a relief, Elena said gently. Not something that made you disappear for 11 days. It was a relief, Julian said. And then, on the drive home, I had to pull over on the side of the highway because I couldn't stop shaking, because somewhere between her telling me she was grateful and me getting back in the car, I understood completely and all at once that if I let myself fall in love with you the way I know I'm capable of falling in love with you, I am eventually going to have something to lose again. And I don't know if I survive it a second time. I don't know if anyone gets to survive that twice. Elena closed her eyes, the weight of the sentence settling somewhere she recognized, distantly, as the exact shape of her own fear, worn by someone else, spoken out loud for the first time. I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen to me, she said quietly. Nobody gets to promise that. Ava couldn't have promised it either, and she loved you enough to write 2 pages telling you not to let fear make that decision for you anyway. I know, Julian said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, the sound of a man finally admitting something he'd been avoiding for 11 days and, if Elena was honest with herself, for 6 years before that. I've read that letter probably 40 times since June. I know exactly what she'd say to me right now, if she could. I just needed 11 days to be able to hear it without falling apart completely. And now? Elena asked. Now I'm standing outside your building, Julian said, and I've been standing here for the last 4 minutes trying to work up the nerve to call up instead of just calling, because I didn't think it was fair to show up unannounced after disappearing for 11 days, and I also couldn't make myself leave without seeing your face while I said the next part. Elena was already moving toward the window before she'd consciously decided to. She looked down and found him there, exactly as promised, phone still pressed to his ear, looking up at her building with the specific, unguarded vulnerability of a man who had spent 11 days deciding whether he was brave enough to be standing where he was currently standing. Come up, she said. He was quiet on the stairs, quiet enough that Elena had already opened her door and stepped back to let him in before either of them said anything else. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, looking at her the way he had looked at her exactly once before, the night he had first told her about Ava, the night he had finally seen her as something other than the woman who seated him 19 times without asking why. I'm sorry, he said, for the 11 days. That wasn't fair to you. No, Elena agreed. It wasn't, but I understand it better than you probably think I do. I'm not choosing this because I'm not scared anymore, Julian said. I don't think that fear goes away. I think Ava's mother is right that I could spend the rest of my life protecting myself from ever feeling this much again, and some days that still sounds like the safer option. But I stood outside your building tonight and realized the safer option isn't actually a life. It's just a very careful, very quiet version of the same museum Ava specifically told me not to build. And I don't want to live in a museum, Elena. I want to find out what it's like to build something new with you, even knowing it might not be permanent, because nothing was ever actually going to be permanent, and I spent 6 years pretending otherwise. Elena felt something in her chest finally unclench, a held breath she had not fully realized she'd been holding since the second missed Wednesday. I was terrified you decided I was too much, she admitted. That I'd asked you to make room for something you weren't ready to make room for, and 11 days of silence was you telling me, as gently as you could, that the room wasn't there. The room's there, Julian said quietly. It just took me 11 days on the side of a highway to stop being afraid of what it would cost to actually walk into it. He crossed the small distance of her doorway then and kissed her, carefully at first, like a man testing whether the ground beneath him was as solid as it had started to feel, and then less carefully, the way people kiss when 11 days of fear finally give way to something neither of them is interested in being careful about anymore. Neither of them said Ava's name again that night. It did not need saying. She had, in her own way, already given them her blessing in handwriting that had waited patiently in a cedar chest for 6 years for exactly this moment to arrive. The months that followed did not unfold the way either of them had expected love to unfold, if either of them had ever let themselves imagine it in advance, which neither of them had. Not really, not after everything that had come before. It was quieter than either of them anticipated, less like the sudden, cinematic collision of two people falling for each other all at once, and more like two careful architects, one literal, one only in the specific, self-taught sense of a woman who had spent a decade learning to read the structural integrity of a room full of strangers, slowly, deliberately reinforcing something neither of them wanted to build twice. Julian started coming to Cardinal and Ash on nights that had nothing to do with any anniversary at all, sitting at ordinary tables for ordinary reasons, staying long after his plate was cleared simply because Elena's shift wasn't over yet, and he had discovered, somewhere in the previous 6 years of eating dinner alone, that he had missed the specific, unglamorous comfort of waiting for someone. Elena, for her part, found herself doing something she had not done in 8 years. She pulled the old sketches out of a box she had moved, unopened, through 3 different apartments, and set them on her kitchen table one Sunday afternoon with the specific, terrified deliberateness of a person reopening a door she had assumed, for a very long time, was permanently closed. Julian found her there when he arrived that evening, hunched over a floor plan for a building that existed nowhere except in the specific architecture of what she had once wanted her life to look like. "You cut these," he said, not quite a question, turning one of the sketches carefully in his hands the way a person handles something they immediately recognize as important to someone they love. "I couldn't throw them away," Elena admitted. "I also couldn't look at them. So I just kept them where I couldn't see them, which felt, at the time, like the same thing as making peace with giving it up." "These are good," Julian said, and there was no performance in the way he said it, no gentle boyfriend-shaped exaggeration, just the flat, professional assessment of a man who had spent his entire career evaluating exactly this kind of work. "This one." He tapped a sketch of a community space with a curved reading room built into what would have been an awkward corner lot. "This solves a problem I've seen actual licensed architects get wrong. Where did you learn to do this?" 2 years of a degree I didn't finish," Elena said. "And then 8 years of managing a restaurant instead." "You could still finish it," Julian said. "Night program. Portfolio review. It's not as far away as 8 years makes it feel." "I have a whole life built around this restaurant," Elena said, and heard, even as she said it, the specific defensiveness of someone protecting a decision she had started, quietly, to question. "You have a whole life built around being needed by other people," Julian said, gently enough that it didn't land as an accusation, though it landed, regardless, somewhere true enough to sting a little. "I spent 5 years watching you take care of a stranger's grief from across a dining room because it was easier than asking for anything for yourself. I don't think that's a criticism. I think it might be the most Elena thing about you. But I also think Ava would have had something very specific to say about anyone, including you, including me, who let fear be the reason they didn't ask for the thing they actually wanted." Elena looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. You're allowed to want this too, you know, Julian added quietly. Wanting something new doesn't erase what the last 8 years of your life were. It just means you're not finished yet. She enrolled in the night program 6 weeks later. She told herself it had nothing to do with him, and knew, even as she told herself that it was at least partly untrue, and decided, for the first time in a long time, that being partly influenced by someone who loved her wasn't the same thing as losing herself to them. It was in late February, with April approaching on a calendar neither of them had said out loud yet, that the first real crack appeared in the new, careful architecture they had spent 9 months building. It started, as these things often do, with something small. Elena was closing out the reservation system on a Tuesday night in early March when she saw a note in the booking calendar, dated for April 14th, in a field she hadn't touched in almost a year. Table for 2. Corner booth. 7 p.m. Julian had made the reservation himself, 3 weeks in advance, using the same phone number the system had recognized for 6 years running. He had not told her he was doing it. She said nothing about it for 2 days, turning the fact over in her mind with the specific, careful anxiety of a woman trying to decide whether she was overreacting to something that might mean nothing, or underreacting to something that meant everything. On the 3rd day, she brought it up over dinner at her own apartment, in the deliberately casual tone she had learned, across a decade of hospitality, to deploy when she needed someone to hear a hard question without feeling ambushed by it. You made the April 14th reservation, she said. The corner booth. Table for 2. Julian went very still. I did, he said carefully. I should have talked to you about it first. I'm sorry. I'm not upset that you want to go back, Elena said, choosing her words slowly. I understand why that date still matters. I'm asking because I don't know what table for 2 means this year, and I think I need to know before it happens instead of finding out live. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a rawness Elena recognized from the night on the phone. 11 days into a silence she had been terrified would never end. I don't fully know either, he admitted. I know I don't want to sit across from an empty chair again. I know I'm not ready to skip the date entirely because I think some part of me will always need to mark it, the way you mark the day you lost someone, whether or not the marking looks the same every year. What I don't know is whether it's fair to ask you to come with me, to sit in a booth that has that much history in it. I don't want you to feel like you're being asked to sit in her chair. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Elena said, relieved, in a complicated way, to finally have the fear named out loud instead of circling both of them unspoken. I've spent 9 months feeling like the woman who gets to have you now that grief has softened enough to let her in. I don't want April 14th to be the night I find out I'm actually just a placeholder in a story that's still, underneath everything, about someone else. You're not a placeholder, Julian said immediately, fiercely enough that Elena believed him before he'd said another word. You have never once been a placeholder. I fell in love with you specifically, not generally. I fell in love with the way you read a room in 4 seconds, and the way you fought me on going back to architecture, and the way you sat down across from a stranger's grief, because some instinct in you couldn't let a person suffer in public without at least offering him a door out of it. None of that is Ava. None of that is a substitute for anything. It's just you, and I love you specifically because you're you, and I have been terrified for weeks that bringing you to that booth would somehow prove the opposite, which is exactly why I booked the reservation without talking to you about it first. I think I was hiding from the conversation instead of having it. Elena felt something in her chest settle, not completely, but enough. Then let's have it, she said. What do you actually want April 14th to look like if you could build it from nothing instead of just repeating what it's always been? Julian was quiet for a long time, and Elena watched him think, really think, in the specific way she imagined he thought through a structural problem at his drafting table, turning it over, testing its weight from every angle, looking for the load-bearing truth underneath the version that just looked good on paper. I think, he said slowly, I want to go. I think I want you there. Not sitting in her chair. I don't ever want you to sit in that specific chair. I think that's important. I think that chair should stay exactly what it's always been. But I think I want a third place setting. Not for me to talk to it the way I used to. Just there. A quiet acknowledgement that she was real, and that she mattered, and that the reason I get to sit across from you at all is because a woman I loved completely once wrote 2 pages telling me not to be afraid of exactly this moment. That sounds right, Elena said softly. That sounds like room in the house for both. I want to ask you something else, too, Julian said, and I want to ask it there that night, if that's all right with you. I don't want to tell you what it is right now. I just want you to know it's coming, so it doesn't blindside you, and so you have time to decide whether you want to say yes to a man who's asking you something enormous in the same booth where he once said goodbye to the woman he thought he was going to spend his whole life with. Elena's breath caught, understanding, with total clarity, exactly what he was telling her without telling her. I think, she said, I already know what I'm going to say. Say it in April, Julian said, with the ghost of a smile that didn't quite hide how nervous he actually was. I've apparently developed a very specific attachment to that date, meaning something enormous. I'd like this to be the last time it has to carry all the weight by itself. There was one more thing Julian had never told her, and he told it to her on a Sunday in late March, sitting at her kitchen table with the same drawer-worn box in his hands that he had carried, unopened by anyone else's eyes, for 6 years. I need to show you something before April, he said, and I need you to understand it before I ask you anything else, because I don't want it sitting between us unspoken on the one night I most need us to be honest with each other. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, modest, old-fashioned in its setting, chosen with the specific care of a man who had spent 3 weeks agonizing over something he'd wanted to be perfect for someone he loved completely. This was for Ava, Julian said quietly. I had it in my pocket the night she died. I've kept it in a drawer for 6 years because I couldn't throw it away and couldn't look at it and definitely couldn't imagine ever giving it to anyone else. I want you to know it exists, because I don't think it's fair to build something with you while hiding a locked drawer in my apartment. But I also want you to know I'm not going to ask you to wear it. Whatever I ask you in April, it's going to come from something new. This ring belongs to her. I think I'm finally ready to give it back, in a way. I called her mother last week. She's going to keep it. I think that's where it was always supposed to end up, eventually, once I was brave enough to let it go. Elena looked at the ring for a long moment, feeling the full, complicated weight of what he was trusting her with. Thank you for showing me, she said softly. And thank you for not asking me to carry something that was always hers. I think that's the last locked drawer, Julian said. I don't have any more of those left. Everything else, you already know. Elena reached across the table and took his hand, and neither of them needed to say anything further, because some truths, once finally spoken, do not require anything more than being received. The weeks between that conversation and April 14th passed with the specific, suspended quality of time spent waiting for something you already know is coming and have chosen, deliberately, not to rush. Elena finished her first portfolio project for the night program, the reading room sketch, refined now with 9 months of returning confidence, submitted with her hands only slightly shaking. Julian took on a project of his own, quietly, without telling her, though she would learn about it later. A small commission for a community garden pavilion, dedicated, in the fine print of the building's plaque, to a pediatric nurse who had once believed dessert should never be delayed for the sake of proper sequence. April 14th arrived the way significant dates always arrive, both suddenly and not suddenly at all, both entirely ordinary and completely unlike any other day on the calendar. Elena did not work that night. She had, for the first time in 6 years, requested it off, and stood instead on the other side of the host stand as a guest, in a green dress she had bought for an occasion she had not let herself fully name, watching a colleague she had trained herself walk Julian toward the corner booth at exactly 7:04, 4 minutes late, as always, a small ritual he had apparently decided, after everything, not to entirely abandon. 3 place settings waited at the table. 1 for Julian. 1 for Elena. and one, smaller, set slightly apart, holding nothing but a single folded napkin and a small votive candle that had not been part of the table's original design. Added, Elena would learn, at Julian's specific request that afternoon. He stood as she approached, the way he had never once stood for her in 5 years of scripted sentences, and pulled out her chair. Not the third seat, not the empty one, but the one directly across from him, the one that had never, in 6 years, belonged to anyone at all. I didn't order the Sancerre, he said, once she was seated, nodding toward a different bottle already breathing at the center of the table. I thought new bottle. Not because the old one meant nothing. Because I wanted tonight to be its own thing, standing next to everything that came before it instead of trying to replace it. I like that, Elena said, and meant it completely. They ate slowly, the way people eat when the meal itself is only the smallest part of what the evening is actually for. They talked about the reading room, about the garden pavilion, which Julian finally told her about, watching her eyes fill when she understood what the plaque would say. They let the third seat sit quietly beside them, its candle burning low and steady, present without demanding anything, honored without being centered. Dessert arrived, ordered first on principle, at Elena's insistence, a detail Julian had told her about months ago and that she had never once forgotten. It was over the dessert, ordered before the entree had even fully cleared the table, that Julian reached into his coat pocket with hands that were, for the first time all night, visibly unsteady. I've been reserving this booth for 6 years, he said, and for 5 of them, I sat here talking to an empty chair, trying to hold on to a future I didn't get to have. I think I finally understand what Ava was trying to tell me in that letter. Grieving someone completely doesn't mean keeping their seat empty forever. It means loving them enough to let their absence become part of the room instead of the whole shape of it. It means being brave enough to build a future anyway, with someone new, without that meaning the first one mattered any less. He opened the small box in his hand, and Elena felt the entire restaurant, for a moment, narrow down to exactly this table, exactly this candlelight, exactly this man who had once eaten dinner alone in front of an audience of nobody and was now asking her, in front of everybody, to help him build the rest of whatever came next. I don't want to reserve a table for 2 once a year anymore, Julian said. I want to reserve one every single week for the rest of my life, and I want it to always have you sitting across from it. Elena Voss, will you marry me? Elena did not answer immediately. She looked, instead, at the third seat beside them, its candle steady in the quiet air of the restaurant, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, distantly as permission, not from Julian, not even from herself, but from a woman she had never met, who had loved this man enough, 6 years ago, to write down exactly the words he would need to hear on exactly this night. Yes, she said, and the word came out steadier than she expected, carrying the specific, hard-won certainty of a woman who had spent a decade taking care of other people's happiness and had finally, completely, without reservation, said yes to her own. Yes, Julian. 1,000 times yes. The restaurant, which had been quietly, collectively holding its breath in the specific way restaurants do when they sense something enormous unfolding at table 12, erupted into the kind of applause that servers remember for years afterward, the kind that makes its way into the stories staff tell new hires about the strangest, most beautiful nights the restaurant had ever witnessed. The third candle burned quietly beside them through the rest of the evening, and neither of them blew it out. It was still lit, small and steady, when they finally left, well past closing, into an April night that felt, for the first time in 6 years, less like the anniversary of an ending and more like the beginning of something Ava Sinclair had never gotten to see, but had, in her own careful, generous handwriting, made entirely possible anyway. They were married the following spring, on a date that had nothing to do with April 14th, chosen deliberately so that the day would belong only to them. Ava's mother came. She sat in the second row beside Julian's own mother, and when Elena caught her eye during the vows, the older woman simply nodded once, the specific, generous nod of a person releasing something she had been quietly holding for 6 years, and Elena understood, without either of them needing to say it aloud, that she had just been given a second blessing to match the one already waiting for her in 2 pages of careful, slanted handwriting. Elena finished her architecture program that same year. Her final capstone project was a small community reading room, built around a curved corner nook that solved, elegantly, a problem her professors had spent an entire semester insisting was unsolvable. She dedicated it, in the single line of acknowledgement the program allowed, to a pediatric nurse she had never met, who had taught her, through the careful architecture of a letter written 8 months before her own death, that the bravest structures are the ones built to hold room for someone else's future. But every April 14th after that, without fail, Julian and Elena returned to Cardinal and Ash, to the same corner booth, and asked for a table for 3. 1 seat for Julian, 1 for Elena, and 1, small and steady and lit by a single candle, kept not out of grief anymore, but out of gratitude for the woman whose last gift to the man she loved had been the courage to let him love again. If someone came to mind while you were listening to this, someone who taught you, even by leaving, how to let love back in, say their name in the comments. Just their name. Nothing else. Priya still tells the story to new hires every year, right around the second week of April, when the reservation book fills up with couples celebrating anniversaries that mean nothing to anyone but them. She tells them about the man who used to talk to an empty chair. She tells them about the manager who finally sat down across from him. She never quite manages to tell it without her voice catching somewhere near the end, and she has stopped apologizing for that, because some stories, she has decided, are supposed to move you exactly that much. Every single time, no matter how many times you've heard them before. Follow this channel for a new story every week, because sometimes the emptiest chair at the table is the one that finally teaches us how to fill it.